Chapter 3: Fundamentals of Argument Construction and Evaluation. Introduction. Now that you know what an argument is and how to distinguish it from other forms of reasoning and discourse, we are going to deal with the basics of argumentation. First, we discuss the process of evaluating arguments, then the process of constructing them. Fundamentals of Argument Evaluation. Once you have identified and extracted an argument, you are ready to evaluate it, to ask, what are the logical merits and demerits of this argument? To answer this question, you need to have two things. One, a general grasp of the criteria that enter into the logical evaluation of arguments, and two, practice in evaluating arguments. Let's go back to what we said about the process of argumentation. We claimed that an argument is an attempt to trace a rational route from a starting point, premise or premises, to a destination, conclusion. If you begin here with these premises, the argument says, then, if you want to be consistent, you must wind up here. An argument is good to the extent that the route it proposes to trace from premises to conclusion is a solid one, like a good map, with directions that get you where you want to go. On the other hand, an argument is bad to the extent that the route it lays out is filled with detours, dead ends, roadblocks, and other pitfalls. Before we present the criteria for assessing the merits of an argument, we want to introduce the notion that arguments can be thought of as located somewhere along a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum are the really good arguments. At the other end are the really bad arguments. Most arguments, however, can be found in the broad middle range, with both strengths and weaknesses. Rarely is an argument so good that it cannot profit from criticism, and seldom is an argument so bad that it cannot be improved by criticism. Most arguments with defects are capable of being revised so as to strengthen the argument. If you think a particular argument is airtight, that might be because you have not thought deeply enough about the issues or don't know enough about the positions it competes with, or you have not really examined the argument closely. Always a danger when the argument favors a position you agree with. If, on the other hand, you think a particular argument is worthless, that might be because you've saddled yourself with blinders and won't let yourself consider the possibility that such a line of argument might have merit. Most arguments fall into the middle band of the spectrum. The purpose of argument analysis is to enable you to see both the pluses and the minuses in an argument and thereby reach an overall verdict on the argument while guarding against premature acceptance or rejection. A logically good argument, as we shall use this term, is one whose premises supply strong grounds for any reasonable person to accept the conclusion. In other words, a reasonable person would accept its conclusion based on its premises and would be justified in so doing. It should be clear that the logical merit of an argument can be independent of its other virtues, or defects. Among the latter, we count the clarity and elegance of its expression, its persuasiveness in the sense of its capacity to move the audience to agreement, its economy in the sense of supplying exactly the grounds needed, no less and no more. These extra-logical merits are not, however, incompatible with good logic. Indeed, an argument that is good overall will have most, if not all, of these merits. Utopian expectations about what is required for a decent argument are perhaps natural but should be resisted. By their nature, arguments come into being against a background of controversy, of diverse opinion and differing points of view. Moreover, the issues they address are usually difficult to resolve. How to prevent the devastation of the environment while yet supporting economic development, how to deal with the federal deficit, what to do about the rise in crime, and so on. The heterogeneity of beliefs and values surrounding these issues, combined with their complexity, makes it unrealistic to expect any argument to establish its conclusions as the final word and shut down all alternatives. That just won't happen. To require of a good argument that it prove its conclusion beyond any possible doubt or criticism is unrealistic. Proof may be an appropriate standard to invoke in geometry and algebra, but in the realm of everyday arguing about contentious issues, it is inappropriate. An argument may be quite good even without proving its conclusion true. At the other extreme lies another mistaken attitude about evaluating arguments. Many people evaluate arguments by one standard only. Does it support my view or not? This is not a viable standard. If this were the standard, then the consequence must be relativistic. Because what one person regards as a strong argument because supportive of his position, another rejects as weak because it goes against her position. Adoption of such a standard would put subjectivity in the saddle and would, moreover, contradict the very ethos of argumentation, which is that the process of argumentation is a potential tool for assessing the merits of any position. To engage in the practice is to admit in principle the possibility that your premises do not constitute good grounds for your conclusion, even though at the moment you think they do. In our view, logical evaluation requires sensitivity to the different positions on the table and to points of evidence. It requires that you be able to put yourself into the position of an intelligent and thinking bystander and ask, quite apart from whether I am predisposed to accept or reject the conclusion, does this argument display the features of a good argument or not? Or better still, how many of the features that make an argument strong does this one possess? Judgment of the logical merits of an argument will also depend on the purposes for which the argument is being appraised and on the circumstances in which the appraisal is made. For instance, in any real-life setting, an argument must be of manageable length because of the finiteness of time, energy, and money. Thus, newspapers restrict the length of letters to the editor. Opinion columns have a specified length. The brief you write for your boss is limited to 5 typed pages, and so on. In such circumstances, a good argument must include the essential lines of support and omit unnecessary details. When it doesn't matter as much that the conclusion is true as that other considerations are satisfied, a rough and ready argument will suffice. For example, when you are eating at a restaurant, it's more important to order the meal and enjoy the conversation than it is to work out all the arguments for and against each menu selection. The best argument in this situation would identify the major determinants of a good choice, what you hate or can't eat, and what you don't want to miss. Sometimes what matters most is avoiding a disastrous mistake, while any of a range of good choices will satisfy. Think of a team of architects and engineers discussing a design problem. In that case, the good argument will be most precise, detailed, well-confirmed, and complete about how to be sure the building won't collapse during an earthquake, and the good argument will be more speculative and open-ended about choice of finishing materials and colors. Enough of the preliminaries. It's time for you to put your instincts to work on some examples. For each of the 4 examples that follow, we ask you to read the argument carefully and make sure that you have grasped it correctly. Then decide how strong you think the argument is, and write out your own reasons for the verdict. Only after thinking about how you would argue for your judgment should you proceed to compare your views with others. Example 1. A letter to Ann Landers read, Dear Ann Landers, my 16-year-old cousin sent for your booklet called Teenage Sex and 10 Ways to Cool It. She sent her 50 cents and the self-addressed envelope like it said at the foot of your column. When the booklet arrived, she read it right away and phoned me to say that it was very good and gave her a lot to think about. Well, Ann Landers, 3 months later she was pregnant and got married very fast. Her mother almost had a heart attack. What I want to know is, why do you recommend booklets if they don't do any good? Example 2. This example deals with highway speed limits. In the 70s, the speed limit on interstate highways was reduced from 70 to 55 miles per hour. In an article in En Route magazine, Len Coates objected as follows. Yes, it is true that the 55 mile per hour saves lives. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that 4,500 lives have been saved by the 55 mph limit. But surely there are more cost-efficient ways of saving lives, such as equipping every house with a smoke detector that would cost $50,000 to $80,000 per life, or putting more dialysis machines in hospitals, $30,000 per life. Example 3. This is an excerpt from Josiah Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. New York, Bernard Geiss, 1967, about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Thompson is discussing the question, where did the first bullet go? Page 39. The testimony of Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman adds weight to the theory that the first bullet only lodged in the president's back. Seated in the right front seat of the presidential limousine, Kellerman heard Kennedy yell, "My God, I'm hit," just after the first shot. Since the projectile that caused the throat wound ripped his windpipe in passing, it seems unlikely that the president could have spoken after receiving the throat wound. Example 4. Harper's March 1982 published an article by David Owen titled "The Secret Lives of Dentists," in which Owen discussed in great detail the hazards of being a dentist and the pressures dentists face, both financial and psychological. He stated, "The divorce rate in the profession has risen 12% in the last decade, and drug abuse, alcoholism, and suicide have also been on the rise." Many dentists took exception. One, whose letter was quoted in the May 1982 issue of Harper's, stated, "If someone had read David Owen's article, The Secret Lives of Dentists, to me, I would have sworn it had been published in the National Enquirer." This childish bunch of half-truths and snide innuendo is a low blow to a hard-working and dedicated profession. I do not know a single case of a dentist who took his own life. An alcoholic dentist doesn't stay in business very long. Before reading further, make your own judgments about each of the 4 arguments, then compare your judgments with ours. Example 1. This is a weak argument. Intuitively, you might have reasoned that highly disappointed is jumping to a conclusion. He reasons from one case in which the booklet apparently failed to prevent someone from becoming pregnant to the implied conclusion that the booklet is not effective in general. If highly disappointed were reasoning more carefully, less in the throes of his disappointment, he would have seen that more evidence is needed to reach that general conclusion, such as how others who have read the booklet have been affected. The booklet's failure to convince one person would not show that it does no good at all. Note, one can also raise the question of whether this case presents any evidence at all for the general thesis. Highly disappointed's cousin may have read and then rejected the advice in the booklet. Moreover, there is some difficulty in deciding upon the criteria by which one should judge the effectiveness of such a booklet. Example 2. This is a poor argument. It may be true that we could save lives by equipping every house with a smoke detector, but that has nothing to do with saving lives on the highway, which is what the argument is about here. Lowering speed limits doesn't interfere with installing smoke detectors. Example 3. We think this is a fairly strong argument. If the first bullet pierced Kennedy's throat, as some allege, then Kellerman could not have heard what he said he heard. Hence his testimony adds weight to the theory that the first bullet only lodged in the president's back. Thompson's conclusion is presented in a qualified way, adds weight, seems unlikely, and he presents contrary evidence later in the book. No one else heard what Kellerman heard the president say. But if the facts are as recorded in example 3, they provide fairly compelling evidence that the first bullet did not pierce Kennedy's throat, but lodged in his back. Example 4. This argument limps badly. The dentist means to argue that Owen has his facts wrong. The dentist adduces 2 premises. 1, he does not know of a single dentist who took his own life, and 2, an alcoholic dentist doesn't stay in business very long. First, though we can grant that the first premise is true, it doesn't follow that Owen's claim about the rate of suicide is wrong, for this dentist's colleagues may not be representative of the profession. Second, the second premises needs to be defended with some reasoning and evidence, for it is not obviously true. Some alcoholics, including doctors, lawyers, and business executives, manage to keep working for years. Owens hasn't shown that dentists are different in this respect. It may be that Owen got his facts wrong. Indeed, the dentist would have a more effective line of objection here had he challenged Owen to produce some evidence for his claims, but the dentist's argument does not succeed in showing that. Looking back now, you will see that our exercise contained 3 weak arguments and 1 fairly strong one. In this text, we will often be focusing on bad arguments, why they are bad, and how they might be improved. Such an emphasis runs the risk of creating the impression that all arguments are flawed. Not so. One common complaint about the fallacy approach to argumentation is that it produces jaundiced students, determined in advance to flog any weakness in an argument but blind to its strengths. It would be inappropriate here to engage in a defensive fallacy theory against such criticisms. The set of observations that follow should help you to understand the focus and framework in this text. First, a solid game of defense is often the best offense. It surely helps. All that can be objected to is overuse of the defensive tools fallacy theory provides. But this is a problem for the teaching and learning of almost any new skill. The beginner initially wants to apply them, and at first lacks the skill and judgment to do so with discrimination. The same danger applies to any approach to logical criticism. Second, the ability to spot flawed reasoning or dubious evidence in others' arguments can profitably be turned inward. Indeed, there is small profit in picking out weaknesses in the reasoning of others if one is unable to spot those same shortcomings in one's own arguments. By using knowledge of fallacies to be self-critical as well as being critical of the logic of other reasoners, you can double your gain and avoid one-sidedness. Third, in the exercises that accompany each chapter, we will include specimens that we think are good arguments along with the bad ones to keep you on your toes and guard against an overly negative mindset. Fourth, from the outset you will be expected to give good arguments for this or that fallacy. In the long run, you are going to be given the responsibility of showing good judgment and discrimination in your evaluations. Are the flaws really serious ones or not? You will have to decide and to defend that decision. We turn now to the crucial question: what are the criteria for good arguments? We are going to elicit these by looking at the arguments we have already presented and the ways in which these arguments violated the criteria. The flaws we will be discussing are called fallacies. Fallacy. By fallacy, we mean a pattern of argumentation that violates one of the criteria a good argument must satisfy and that occurs with some marked degree of frequency. A fallacy, as we understand the concept, is necessarily located in an argument. There are other meanings of the term fallacy, such as a mistaken belief. The gambler's fallacy, for example, refers to the mistaken belief that since a penny has landed on heads 6 times in a row, it is now due to land on tails. Our definition, see box, also requires that the pattern occur with some frequency. If we were to label every violation of a good argument's criteria a fallacy, we would have an unmanageably long list. Consequently, we restrict the term to those cases where the violation is frequent enough to be worth labeling. In our evaluation of the examples, we made implicit reference to the criteria for good argumentation. It is time to make them explicit. When we said that argument 1 was a weak argument because highly disappointed did not provide enough evidence to support his conclusion, we were implicitly appealing to the standard of sufficiency, i.e., that the premises of an argument must provide sufficient support for its conclusion. To illustrate the flaw in example 2, we appealed to a different criterion. By saying that equipping homes with smoke detectors had nothing to do with saving lives on the highway, we were charging that the reason offered was irrelevant to the conclusion. We were implicitly appealing to the standard of relevance, i.e., that the premises of an argument must be relevant to the conclusion. Finally, we found that example 4 was weak because we could not accept the dentist's premises. Here, we were implicitly appealing to the standard of acceptability, i.e., that the premises must be acceptable. If you look back over the italicized words, the key words in our assessments, you will see that there are 3 different criteria that an argument must satisfy in order to be a good argument. First, the premises must be relevant to the conclusion. They must pass the relevance test. Second, the premises must provide sufficient support for the conclusion. They must pass the sufficiency test. Third, the premises must be acceptable. They must pass the acceptability test. We shall have more to say about each of these criteria in the next section. In Figure 3-1, we offer a graphic representation of them in the RSA triangle. This figure identifies the criteria that a good argument must satisfy. An argument that fails to satisfy any one or more of these criteria is, in that respect and to that degree, a flawed argument. In our way of approaching the study of fallacy, then, there are three basic kinds of fallacy: fallacies of relevance, fallacies of sufficiency, and fallacies of acceptability. However, in presenting the fallacies in the following chapters, we have used a different organization. In Chapter 5, we study fallacies that are in some way diversionary. In Chapter 6, we study fallacies that impersonate good arguments. In Chapter 7, we study fallacies that have a linguistic basis. In Chapter 8, we study fallacies that seek to persuade by intimidation. And in Chapter 9, we study the attitudes that cause people to reason fallaciously. Other logical traditions take a different approach to what is required for an argument to be logically adequate. Logicians have typically distinguished two types of argument, or two types of inference found in arguments: an inductive argument or inference, whose characteristic feature is that the premises render the conclusion probable, and a deductive argument or inference, whose characteristic feature is that the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. Deductive arguments are characteristic of mathematics. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, are typically found in the empirical sciences. One kind of inductive reasoning that enjoys high profile in this society is the technique of sampling, featured in polling and opinion research. We discussed this briefly in Chapter 4. If one accepts this dichotomy, which the authors of this text are not happy with, then one does not speak of across-the-board good arguments, but rather of sound arguments, in the cause of deductive arguments, and strong arguments, in the case of inductive ones. The crucial question for evaluation then becomes, what constitutes soundness, or what constitutes inductive strength? Such matters are dealt with in most formal logic textbooks. We make no attempt to deal with these concepts in this text. To conclude this section, we offer these additional observations about our approach to argument analysis. First, the fallacies we discuss are logical miscues that occur with some regularity in arguments in everyday discourse. You may find that our coverage of fallacies is narrower than that of some texts, i.e., we don't include as many fallacies as some do. We have listed only those that we believe show up with greatest frequency. A standard criticism of the fallacy approach to argument analysis is that there can be no complete inventory of fallacies because there is no complete list of the ways people go wrong in their reasoning. That may well be true, but it is of questionable relevance to our purposes. We believe there can be many lists that are useful without being complete. For example, lists of grammatical mistakes, lists of typically misspelled words, and lists of common reasons why a car's engine won't start. Second, the fallacies we discuss all have names or labels selected with a view to indicating the flaw they embody. Some are vivid: straw person, red herring, slippery slope; others more pedestrian: questionable cause. What we want to impress on the reader at the outset is that the objective in learning the fallacy approach is not to enable you to throw these labels around in casual conversations to impress people with your logical savvy. It is never enough just to sprinkle your conversation with claims such as, "That's a red herring." Most of the people you argue with will not have taken a logic or critical thinking course. So when you talk with them, you have to make your points about arguments without resorting to the labels used in this text. The value of these labels is primarily mnemonic, to help you recall various sorts of mistakes in argumentation that people frequently make. Third, our treatment of each fallacy centers around the identity conditions. These conditions serve a dual function. Not only do they define the fallacy, but they guide you in your effort to show that the fallacy has been committed in a specific argument. Claiming that an argument is fallacious is not useful to you or the arguer unless you have good grounds for your opinion. You will need to make a reasonable argument to support your view. Think of your role of a logical critic as like that of the prosecutor in a court of law. The prosecutor must show that there is enough evidence to convict a citizen of having violated a specific and named law or statute. The prosecutor would be laughed out of court were he to say he's guilty of something or other, but I can't say what. Nor can the prosecutor hope to get by with simple assertions, though he must assert. He cannot state the defendant shoplifted that Rolex unless he can produce evidence of the crime, eyewitnesses, sworn statements, and so on. Similarly, you must be able to show that a given argument is guilty of a specified violation. To do this, you need to show that each of the fallacy conditions is satisfied in the case at hand. Mere assertions won't do the job. If you were to assert no more than some such unsubstantiated charge as this premise is irrelevant to that conclusion without arguing for your claim, your case would be thrown out of court for lack of evidence. Fourth, and this harks back to a point made at the beginning of this chapter, the charge of fallacy is nothing more than an initial critical probe of the argument. It is an attempt to locate a possible weakness, not the bold and sometimes arrogant assertion that because of this flaw the argument is worthless. Even if the charge of fallacy is justified in a given instance, that does not mean the argument cannot be repaired over the flaw, nor does it follow that the conclusion of the argument is false. One may argue poorly or inadequately on behalf of a true statement as conclusion, just as it is possible to argue well on behalf of a false or unacceptable belief. When you criticize an argument as fallacious, remember that all you have shown is that there is a potential obstacle on the route traced by the arguer from premises to conclusion. You have shown that the conclusion has not been adequately argued for. That leaves open the possibility that the arguer can revise the argument so that the conclusion is adequately supported. With those observations behind us, we are ready to proceed with our discussion of argument construction. Fundamentals of argument construction. It is a good idea to approach the construction of arguments in a methodical way, with a clear idea of your objectives. Otherwise, you risk using bad arguments, overlooking good ones, failing to cover your bases, and failing to be very persuasive. What is my position? First, ask yourself, what is my position? What precisely is it I want to argue for? Write out the answers to these questions. Second, ask yourself, have I stated one claim or more than one? It is quite common to bundle two or more different propositions together. Suppose, for example, your claim is that abortion is wrong because it is murder. Notice that you have already made two claims. 1. Abortion is wrong, and 2. Abortion is murder. It is best to separate distinct claims and argue for them separately. Is your claim made as clearly as it can be? Have you stated exactly what it is you want to argue for? Suppose you deal with your second claim, that abortion is murder, first. What exactly does that claim commit you to? When you call abortion murder, you are presupposing that it is wrong, and since you are probably interested in arguing for the second claim because you think it leads to the first, you are presupposing what you are arguing for when you call abortion murder. So it is best to revise your claim to avoid that flaw, claiming instead that abortion is the taking of innocent life. Furthermore, since what you are talking about is abortion and not the taking of life in general, like killing animals for food, for example, it would be better to restrict your second claim even further by saying abortion is the taking of innocent human life. Now your position is much clearer. What makes me think my position is true or plausible? It is a good idea at this point to try to formulate the reasons or evidence that have led you to believe the claim you want to argue for. Do you have one reason or several? Do your reasons fall into different groups? Here is where you write out a draft of your argument. This draft will almost certainly have to be revised later. The same standards of relevance, acceptability, and sufficiency that you use to judge other people's arguments should be used to judge your own. We think a helpful way to do so is to think of the objectives of your argument. What is the purpose of my argument? Having clarified your conclusion and set out the reasons or evidence that seem to you to support it, pause and consider what your aim is in formulating the argument. Several different purposes are possible, and each will lead to a different tailoring of the draft of your argument. A. You want to persuade a particular person. In this case, ask yourself what beliefs or values you share with that person that you can appeal to. Also, since you think the person needs persuading, presumably he or she is opposed to your conclusion for some reason. So ask yourself what objectives the person has or is likely to have to your conclusion. If you haven't done so already, you will need to find reasons that respond to those objections. There are 3 possible ways to get around objections. One is to show that the objections are mistaken. A second is to show that the objections, although true, do not really refute your position. The third is to change your position slightly by qualifying it or weakening it in some other way, so that the objection no longer applies to it. B. You want to prove or refute a point to a particular group. In this case, you need to consider more widely what beliefs or values you share with everyone in that reference group, and what objections have been or might be raised against your position by any member of your intended audience. C. You want to demonstrate your capacity to make a thorough case for your position. That is normally the aim you should have as a student writing an essay or fulfilling some other assignment. You need to show your instructor your capabilities. When you are assigned exercises from this book, for example, you are almost always asked to support your judgments. What is being requested, in effect, is that you give arguments to show that your answer is correct. When you are demonstrating your competence, you may need to show that you are familiar with the issues and arguments related to your conclusion contained in some body of research literature. You could then borrow, with acknowledgement, arguments from that literature that you think are good ones and respond to criticisms of your position that were made in that literature. If you are trying to defend your answer to one of the exercises in this book, the task is slightly different. In that case, you are usually trying to show that there is a flaw in someone else's argument. Your role is akin to that of a prosecuting attorney trying to establish that someone has committed a legal offense. The person whose argument you are critiquing presumably thought the argument was perfectly all right. So, were the person present, his or her role would be that of a defense attorney, trying to show that the prosecution's case is no good. It is not enough, therefore, just to state that the argument has some flaw. You must also give reasons that would persuade an impartial judge or jury. The argument is, as it were, innocent until proven guilty in the eyes of that impartial arbiter. The judge is the audience you have to persuade, and the presumption of the innocence of the argument from any flaw is what you will have to overcome in order to do so. There are other possible objectives you may have in building an argument. For example, you may want to test the truth of a claim you are curious about. Is it true or false? You will try to find the strongest arguments that support it and the strongest ones against it, so that you will be able to compare the merits of the two. But we will not go into this or any other possible goals here. After you have made your arguments, it is always a good idea to review and revise them with a view to clarity as well as correctness. Is your reasoning easy to follow? You won't persuade a reader who can't see what you are driving at. Have you stated your premises and conclusions clearly? If either are vague or muddled, then your argument loses its force. Have you said anything in a way that could be interpreted differently from the way you mean it? Try to imagine yourself in the role of someone who holds a position contrary to yours and think about how this person is going to interpret what you have written. That exercise can lead to clarifying revisions. We have listed a number of do's. Here are 3 don'ts. First, we recommend against using rhetorical questions. For example, who in his right mind would accept this claim, when the purpose of your argument is to demonstrate your knowledge or understanding? In almost every case, you will end up with a claim that is incumbent upon you to defend. It turns out then that rhetorical questions tend to be lazy ways of avoiding the onerous task of producing an argument to support the claim. Second, be wary of using what you need to provide as part of your argument. For example, if you want to claim that an argument's premises are insufficient, it won't do to say the premises are insufficient because they don't provide enough evidence for the conclusion. What you need to prove is just that the premises don't give enough evidence. Or, if you want to argue that a premise is irrelevant, it won't do to say the premise is irrelevant because it gives no reason for that conclusion. Again, to prove irrelevance, what you have to show is that the premise supplies no reason. Third, make sure that you are supplying the right kind of argument yourself. For example, don't argue that a premise is unacceptable by saying the premise hasn't been proved, so it is unacceptable. Absence of proof does not show unacceptability. Instead, you must give some specific reason for doubting or questioning the premise. Summary. In this chapter, we have been concerned with the fundamentals of the process of argumentation. In the first part, we introduced you to the task of evaluating arguments by giving you some examples to work over. In our discussion, we introduced the concept of fallacy, which will move center stage in the next section of the book, chapters 4 through 9. In the second part of this chapter, we introduced you to the task of constructing arguments. Further discussion of this aspect of argumentation will be found in section 4, Advanced Argumentation.